kettle begins first with that soft, rising whisper you can almost feel in your shoulders before you hear it clearly, and somewhere nearby, a clock keeps its patient little tick as if the whole house is breathing in time. It is the sort of sound that belonged to kitchens before dawn, or just after supper, when a woman stood for a moment with her hands resting on the table and listened to her own home settling around her. Tonight we are going into that room, into the kitchen wisdom that seemed ordinary once, and then, little by little, slipped so quietly away after the 1940s that many people hardly noticed it leaving. If this kind of gentle history is your sort of evening company, you can like the video and subscribe, only if it truly feels comforting to you. And if you would like, leave me a comment telling me where you are listening from, and what bit of kitchen know-how you remember someone older teaching you. Perhaps how to test a cake, save leftovers, stretch a meal, or tell by smell alone when something was just right. Because once you begin thinking about it, a whole home can come back from one small remembered lesson. So settle in now, and let the memory of a kitchen like this rise up if it wants to, whether it is one you knew in real life or one you can only half imagine from stories, family photographs, and the look of old cupboards in your mind. There is a chair somewhere nearby, a warm light, and no need to hurry. What did a woman once know about her kitchen without ever calling it expertise? How did she read an oven that had no glowing numbers, no little beep, no cheerful electronic promise of perfection? Why did so much household knowledge live in the hands, the nose, the ear, the eye, and in quiet habits repeated so often that they seemed almost invisible? And what disappeared when homes became faster, cleaner, more convenient, and in some ways a little less intimate with the work that kept them running? Come with me now, gently, into an American kitchen in about 1938, though some of what you will find there lingered into the war years and only began to fade more quickly after 1945. Step softly over the threshold and let the room gather around you. The kitchen is not yet the bright display room of later decades. It is a working room first, shaped by use more than fashion, though there may be a cheerful oilcloth on the table, a curtain at the window, and a shelf where crockery stands in practical little ranks. The floor may be wood, scrubbed and worn smooth in the pathways between sink, stove, and pantry, or it may be covered in linoleum, that faithful material that did not pretend to be grand, but was praised for being sensible, easy to wipe, and forgiving of spilled flour. A broom leans nearby like a quiet co-worker waiting to be called. If you stand still, you can begin to understand the room by its sounds. A stove ticking as it cools, water running into a basin, the clink of a jar set down on a counter, the slap of dough, the swish of a skirt passing a chair. The kitchen is full of knowledge before a single word is spoken. It is a room that teaches by repetition. You learn where the hot spots are, where the draft creeps in under the back door in winter, how long milk keeps in warm weather, how quickly biscuits colour when the oven is feeling lively, and where to set rising bread so it is warm enough but not too warm. Nothing in here is merely in here. Each object has its little circle of customs around it. That is one of the pieces of wisdom that has vanished most thoroughly. Not simply recipes, though those too have changed, but a whole body of practical household understanding that once passed from woman to woman almost without ceremony. You did not need a special phrase like life hack. It was simply what you knew if you kept house. If the potatoes were starting to sprout, you knew which could still be used and which had gone too far. If a pan scorched, you knew what to soak, what to scrape, and what not to confess until after supper, if anyone needed sparing. If the weather turned muggy, you expected your pastry to behave differently, and did not take it as a personal insult, though you might raise an eyebrow at it. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and into the 1930s and 1940s, kitchens in many homes were places where old methods and newer ideas stood side by side. Scientific housekeeping was much discussed in magazines, extension courses, demonstration kitchens, county fairs, radio programs, and women's pages in newspapers. Efficiency, sanitation, nutrition, and modern equipment all had their champions. Yet for all that talk of progress, most women still relied every day on older forms of knowledge that no textbook could quite replace. They had to. Appliances varied, fuel varied, money varied, regional habits varied. Even the same recipe could behave differently in a cast iron stove in January than in a gas range in July. If you let your eyes close for a moment, you can almost feel the rhythm of that. The kitchen is not a place of rigid instructions so much as adjustment. A hand on a kettle lid, a glance through an oven door, a quick taste from the wooden spoon, a turn of the wrist. It is intimate work, repeated work, skilled work hidden inside ordinary motions. Take the oven, for instance, because so much old kitchen wisdom gathered around that one metal box. Before thermostats became fully dependable and universal, and even after they began to appear, many cooks still treated the heat of the oven as something to be interpreted rather than obeyed. A recipe might call for a slow oven, a moderate oven, or a hot oven. Those words sound quaint now, almost like they belong in a storybook, but they were serious instructions once. A woman learned what moderate meant in her own kitchen, not in the abstract. She might test the oven with a square of white paper, watching how quickly it browned. She might hold her hand near the heat for a counted number of seconds, using a method that sounds brave to modern ears, and perhaps was, though not in a dramatic way, just in the cheerful daily way women once did mildly dangerous things because lunch had to be made. And because ovens were temperamental, recipes themselves were more alive. A cake was not a thing guaranteed by the press of a button. It was a small negotiation between batter, pan, heat, weather, and experience. You learned the look of a batter that needed another spoonful of flour. You learned that eggs in winter behave differently if they had been cold from the pantry. You learned that pie crust wanted a light hand and as little fuss as possible, not unlike certain relatives at Christmas. You learned that opening the oven door too often was an invitation to disappointment. No one needed to explain the chemistry every time. The hands remembered first. And that is another vanished thing. The hand memory of domestic work used to be so common that people hardly named it. Women could roll biscuit dough by feel, shell peas while carrying on a conversation, patch a child's overalls in poor light, or judge when jam would set by the way it fell from the spoon. Measurements mattered, of course, but not always in the strict modern sense. A cup might be level or generous depending on the cook and the context. A pinch was a real quantity. Butter the size of an egg was meaningful. Flour enough to make a soft dough was meaningful. Stir until it looks right. Bake until done. To a beginner, those words may sound exasperating, but to someone raised in that world, they were perfectly sensible. The food itself told you what came next. Recipes printed before and during the 1940s often assumed this background knowledge. They did not hold your hand because they assumed your own hand already knew a good deal. They might tell you to cream butter and sugar well, but not define precisely what well meant. They might tell you to scald milk, though fewer modern cooks would think to do it unless a specific baking method called for it. They might assume you knew how to freshen stale bread in the oven, clarify fat, wash lettuce carefully in several waters, or save bacon drippings for later use. The kitchen was an ecosystem of ingredients and remnants, not a parade of single-use items. The pantry tells that story beautifully. Open the door, and you do not just see food, you see planning. Jars, paper-wrapped parcels, sacks folded tight, maybe canned peaches or beans put up at home if the family had the means, the garden, or the country connections. Maybe pickles, preserves, relishes, chow-chow, jars of fruit, and a row of spices that were not necessarily many, but each earned its keep. Sugar was often kept with some caution against dampness and ants. Flour was watched for weevils. Potatoes and onions had to be stored wisely. Crackers were tucked into tins to keep them crisp. Bread was protected but not always coddled. Nothing was expected to last forever just because it had been purchased. Refrigeration did begin to change all of this, of course. By the late 1930s and into the 1940s, more households had electric refrigerators than in earlier decades, though not all homes had them at the same time or with the same reliability. The coming of refrigeration altered shopping habits, leftovers, food safety, desserts, daily routines, and the whole emotional weather of the kitchen. Iceboxes had already offered cold storage, but they required deliveries, drainage, and attention. Electric refrigerators offered a steadier sort of convenience. They reduced some worries. They opened new possibilities. They also slowly loosened older habits of preserving, timing, and close observation. Before that transition was complete, women often managed food with astonishing attentiveness. They knew where the coolest corner of the house was. They knew how long cream would hold. They knew that butter might need to be kept in a certain crock or under a wet cloth. They knew not to trust warm weather with fish, custard, or meat longer than common sense allowed. They smelled, they looked, they touched. They did not have expiration dates acting as little domestic traffic policemen. They had judgment. Judgment was one of the great kitchen inheritances. It covered food, yes, but also economy, cleanliness, timing, and care of people. In many households, especially where money was not abundant, kitchen wisdom meant knowing how to make one roast become several meals, how to save bones for soup, how to turn stale cake into a pudding, or yesterday's potatoes into something that looked entirely intentional. A modern refrigerator full of containers labelled in cheerful marker is its own system, but this was another sort of order, often unwritten and deeply understood. Leftovers were not an afterthought, they were part of the original plan. A roast chicken on Sunday might become sandwiches on Monday, broth by Tuesday, and perhaps a little meat for croquettes or a casserole after that. Ham might flavour beans, then lend itself to scalloped potatoes, then make one more appearance minced fine in a supper dish. Bacon drippings went into a jar and did useful work afterward. Bread heels were not lonely. They thickened, filled out, toasted or supported puddings. Cake crumbs could become toppings. Vegetable trimmings had possibilities if they were clean and suitable. This was not romantic thrift for the sake of a magazine article. It was ordinary competence. You can hear it in the scrape of a knife against a chopping board and in the quiet pride of a meal that looks simple but has been thought through from beginning to end. If sleep is beginning to tug at you, that is all right. You can drift along with the spoon against the bowl and let the old kitchen continue working around you. There was also wisdom in shopping itself, especially before the post-war supermarket became the unquestioned centre of family food life. In the 1930s and early 1940s, many women still shopped in a more piecemeal way than later generations would. The grocer, the butcher, the baker, perhaps a produce market, perhaps a milk delivery, perhaps eggs from a neighbour or a backyard flock, depending on place and circumstance. Chain groceries existed, of course, and self-service stores were growing, but the old pattern remained familiar in many communities. Shopping required memory, planning, and an eye for quality. You did not simply wheel a cart beneath bright fluorescent abundance and toss in 12 competing kinds of crackers. You often asked for what you needed, and someone fetched it, weighed it, sliced it, wrapped it, or cut it to order. That meant the housewife often knew her merchants, and they knew something about her. They might know whether she wanted the cheaper cut because she knew how to make it tender. They might know which child disliked liver, though liver arrived anyway because somebody had firm ideas about nourishment. They might know when she was stretching toward payday. They might save bones for her stock or set aside a better cabbage. Such relationships were not always idyllic, And no era should be painted in sugar glaze, but there was a local knowledge in the transaction. The kitchen was connected to a human network of supply. Even the weekly market basket had its wisdom. Seasonal eating was not a moral slogan, it was simply practical reality. Strawberries came and went. Tomatoes had a proper time. Citrus could feel a little special. Lettuce in winter was not assumed to appear in flawless year-round plenty. Women cooked from what was available, affordable and sensible. Menus changed with the weather, and so did methods. Soups and baked dishes in cold months. Salads and lighter fare when summer invited them. The kitchen breathed with the year. Then there was the matter of cleaning, another realm of vanished expertise hidden under the modern phrase household chores, which can make the whole business sound faintly dull and homogeneous. But older kitchen cleaning involved a great deal of material knowledge. A woman knew what boiling water could do and what it should not do. She knew the difference between enamelware, aluminum, tin, cast iron, and wood, and what each object would tolerate. She knew that some stains needed salt, some needed soda, some needed soap, some needed patience, and some needed a brisk silence while one tried not to think of them. The sink itself was once more central than many people now realize. It was not merely a place where dirty dishes accumulated while everyone negotiated with themselves. It was a site of sequence and method. Dishes might be scraped carefully first. Greasy pans might need soaking. Water had to be heated if the house lacked abundant hot running water. And even where hot water existed, people did not always use it with modern abandon. Soap had to be managed. Dish towels had to be clean enough to trust. Drying racks, drain boards, dishpans, and enamel basins all had their roles. A woman often washed in an order that made practical sense, beginning perhaps with glassware or less soiled pieces, and ending with the greasiest, to keep the water useful as long as possible. That order was knowledge. So was the way she wrung out a cloth, aired a towel, wiped a table edge, or left the sink itself cleaner than it had looked at the start. In a time before paper towels replaced half the household linen one square at a time, cloth had to be cared for, washed, boiled if necessary, dried, folded and reused. Flour sacks became towels, aprons, children's dresses or polishing cloths. Today people sometimes speak of sustainability with a certain solemnity. These women would likely have nodded and gone back to turning old fabric into something practical before anyone had finished defining the term. The care of cast iron alone could fill an evening of memory. A skillet was not simply washed and forgotten. It had to be dried properly, sometimes greased lightly, protected from rust, and respected for the surface built over time. If you grew up seeing an older woman handle a cast iron pan, you may remember the certainty of it. She knew where to grasp, how to lift, how to move from stove to table, when to wipe rather than scour, and when a pan had suffered enough interference from other family members who meant well. A seasoned skillet had history in it. You did not abuse it unless you wished to be corrected, perhaps with very few words. Then there were flaws, and how much the flaw reveals about a vanished domestic intelligence. Kitchen floors before the easy age of wall-to-wall synthetic convenience were attended to with extraordinary regularity. Sweeping was daily, sometimes more than once. Crumbs, grit, tracked-in mud, dropped peelings, and ash if there was a solid fuel stove, had to be managed as part of the normal pulse of the day. Scrubbing was different from sweeping. Waxing was different again. A woman knew which corners gathered dust, where the children's shoes did the worst, and how to make a room smell genuinely clean rather than merely perfumed. The smell of a scrubbed floor is one of those historical details that never quite leaves people who knew it. Soap, water, wood, sun through a window, perhaps a faint trace of old meals and fresh air. It was a smell of effort, certainly, but also of order restored. The same goes for clean cupboards, aired bread boxes, rinsed dishcloths hanging to dry, and curtains taken down and washed at the proper season. Kitchen wisdom was not only about cooking, it was the art of keeping disorder from getting too comfortable. Laundry and mending touched the kitchen too, more than we sometimes imagine. In many homes, the kitchen stove helped heat water for wash day, or the kitchen itself became a place for sorting, starching, or drying small items near warmth in bad weather. The line between kitchen work and all the other work of home was not sharp. It was one continuous fabric. A woman might stir soup, watch a child, iron a tea towel, mend an apron, and keep half an eye on bread, rising all in the same span of afternoon. The famous modern term multitasking sounds almost boastful. For many women, then, it was merely Tuesday. And yet the old kitchen was not all labour in a dreary sense. There were comforts there too, and they matter. A chair pulled close to the stove in winter, a cup of tea taken standing up because one finally had a moment, the smell of cinnamon or onions or yeast, a radio on a shelf in the late 1930s and 1940s perhaps, bringing music, cereals, farm reports, recipes, or wartime news into the room where peeling and mixing continued all the same. A child at the table with crayons or homework. A neighbour at the back door, not calling ahead because telephones were not yet household extensions of the hand in the modern way, and because one simply visited. That backdoor life contained its own exchange of wisdom. Women traded recipes, yes, but also information. How long to process beans, how to remove fruit stains, which soap was worth buying, whether a child's cough needed mustard on the chest, rest, or simply time, which grocer had better butter this week, whether wartime ration points could be stretched by trying a new dish with beans, cheese, or organ meats. Domestic knowledge lived socially. It moved through conversation, church suppers, sewing circles, family visits, demonstration clubs, and handwritten notes tucked into cookbooks. By the 1940s, especially during the war years, kitchen wisdom took on fresh dimensions because the entire nation was asked to think carefully about food, waste, and household management. Rationing in the United States affected sugar, coffee, meat, butter, canned goods, gasoline, and other essentials at different points. Women adapted with a resourcefulness that built upon older habits already well developed. Saving fats became a wartime patriotic act because they could be used in making munitions. Victory gardens encouraged home growing. Canning, preserving, and stretching meals became both domestic practice and civic contribution. Newspapers and government pamphlets offered advice, but practical success still depended very much on the cook's experience. Imagine standing in that kitchen in 1943. There is a ration book in a drawer. The radio may be speaking softly. Supper must still be made. Family appetites have not become abstract because history is happening. If meat is scarce, then beans, eggs, cheese, and casseroles matter more. If sugar is tight, desserts are managed differently. If coffee is dear, it is used thoughtfully. A woman learns substitutions not as a trendy experiment, but as an ordinary necessity. She understands portions. She saves drippings. She plans ahead. She serves attractive meals, even when ingredients are limited, because morale in the home is also part of the work. That phrase, making do, has sometimes been repeated so often it loses its texture, but in a real kitchen it was not vague at all. It meant knowing exactly how to make one thing answer for another. It meant adjusting a menu after seeing what was in the icebox. It meant turning a little meat into flavour for a whole pot of food. It meant understanding that presentation could make plain fare feel satisfying. A sprig of parsley, a neat slice, a clean cloth, warm rolls, a pudding made from little. Such details were not frivolous. They were part of the dignity of the meal. Nutrition was another realm where older and newer kitchen knowledge overlapped in interesting ways. By the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, scientific interest in vitamins, balanced meals, child feeding, and protective foods had become mainstream in many forms of public education. Home economics classes, magazines, and radio programs taught women about protein, milk, green vegetables, cereals, and the needs of growing children. Yet these scientific ideas were filtered through old habits, budgets, family tastes, and inherited customs. One woman might talk about vitamin-rich vegetables, while another simply insisted everyone eat their carrots because they were good for you, which was not entirely unscientific, just pleasantly concise. Meals in many homes followed recognizable patterns that carried social order as well as nourishment. Breakfast could be hearty or plain, depending on region, work, and means. Dinner at midday remained common in some communities, especially rural ones. Supper in the evening might be simpler. In other homes, the modern pattern of lighter lunch and evening dinner was becoming more familiar. Coffee was central in many kitchens. So was bread. So were potatoes, milk, eggs, and whatever fruits and vegetables could be managed. Dessert was common, but not always grand. Even a simple stewed fruit, rice pudding, or cookie supplied a sense of completeness. Children learned kitchen wisdom almost by accident at first. A little girl dried silverware. A little boy shelled peas or carried wood or fetched milk. Someone was sent to the pantry. Someone was taught not to slam the icebox door if they knew what was good for them and for the electric bill. Skills entered the body through repetition. A child learned to scrape a bowl properly, to grease a pan, to pare apples in a long curling strip if she was proud enough, to know the difference between simmering and boiling. By adolescence, many girls especially were expected to know at least the basics of cooking and housekeeping, whether learned at home, in school, or both. This was not universally true in every family, but it was common enough to shape expectations. And here we come to something subtle that vanished after the 1940s, or began to. The assumption that domestic competence was a standard form of adulthood, rather than a specialized interest. One can discuss the limitations and social pressures of that expectation, and historians often do with good reason. But if we stay close to the kitchen itself, what we see is that millions of women possessed and used a body of knowledge that modern people often underestimate because it was unpaid, private, and repetitive. They were logisticians, preservationists, cooks, cleaners, budgeters, nutrition managers, repairers, hostesses, and weather readers, all in one apron. The apron, by the way, deserves a moment of respect. It was practical armor. It carried clothespins, handkerchiefs, recipe scraps, a bit of thread, perhaps a child's marble, and evidence of the day's work in flour and splashes. One can almost date a photograph by the style of apron and how it is worn. Full bib aprons, waist aprons, feed sack aprons, good aprons for company, working aprons for ordinary mess. The apron signaled readiness. It meant one was in the middle of things. It also saved many dresses from a shorter life. If you are feeling heavy-eyed now, just keep listening. The room continues gently whether or not you follow every detail. The old kitchen is full of repeated motions, and repeated motions are kind company for sleep. Look up now at the cupboards. What do you notice? Perhaps fewer packaged goods than in a modern kitchen. Fewer brightly branded convenience foods lined up to announce themselves. Before the huge post-war expansion of processed food culture, and before supermarkets trained the eye to expect endless shelf variety, many kitchen staples came in simpler forms: flour, sugar, meal, dried beans, oats, salt, baking powder, coffee, lard or shortening, canned tomatoes, evaporated milk, rice, tea, spices, perhaps gelatin, perhaps cocoa, perhaps corn syrup, perhaps a treasured vanilla bottle. Convenience foods did exist before the 1950s, certainly. Canned soups, boxed mixes of some kinds, breakfast cereals, and prepared products were already part of American life. But after the 1940s, the scale changed. That change matters because once more food preparation shifted from the hand to the package. Some kitchen wisdom naturally faded. If a pie comes ready-made, fewer people learn crust. If vegetables come trimmed and sealed, fewer people learn seasonality, storage, or the small economies of stems and scraps. If sauce comes bottled, fewer people know how to build one from drippings, flour, milk, broth, and instinct. If meals become standardized, then the old intimate negotiation with ingredients grows quieter. Convenience saves time, it truly does, but it also edits out little territories of knowledge. Take gravy, for example, a modest but revealing skill. In many homes, a woman knew how to make gravy almost without thinking, not because she had memorized a ratio from a culinary school manual, but because she had watched and done it many times. Fat in the pan, flour stirred in until smooth, liquid added gradually. Salt, pepper, perhaps milk for cream gravy, perhaps broth or coffee in some regional traditions, perhaps giblet stock if the occasion called for it. The texture had to be watched. Lumps had to be persuaded against. Seasoning had to be judged. Too thin, and one adjusted. Too thick, and one adjusted. It was flexible intelligence in saucepan form. Or think of preserving. In rural homes and in many small towns, and even city households with family support systems, women canned fruit and vegetables, made jelly, put up pickles, or dried herbs. Canning was serious work. It required cleanliness, timing, jars, lids, heat, and confidence. Methods evolved over time as food safety knowledge improved, and not all old methods were equally sound by modern standards. It is important to say that gently and clearly. Still, the general competence involved was considerable. One had to know ripeness, preparation, seasoning, and storage. One had to be willing to spend hot summer days over steam because January would come, and peaches in a jar were a kind of sunshine saved for later. The sight of a pantry shelf full of home-canned jars was more than decorative satisfaction. It represented labor transformed into security. It meant foresight. It meant an understanding of abundance while it was present, and scarcity before it arrived. That habit of storing for the future, both mentally and practically, shaped many homes. After the war, as frozen foods expanded, supermarkets grew, and year-round availability increased. The old annual cycle of preserving loosened. Again, something was gained. Yet something else faded too, the close seasonal conversation between the kitchen and the garden, orchard or market. Bread baking offers another lovely example. Not every household baked bread at home all the time, and bakeries remained important, especially in towns and cities. But many women either had baked bread regularly at some stage or knew how if needed. Bread required planning, patience, and a relationship with yeast. You learned the feel of dough under the palm. You knew what kneading did long before anyone posted a video explaining gluten development. You watched dough rise beneath a cloth in a bowl set near the warmest spot in the room. You punched it down with an oddly satisfying firmness. You shaped loaves and hoped for the right texture. You understood that the weather had opinions. The smell of bread in an older kitchen is one of those scents that gathers people from every room without effort. There is no need to improve upon it. Fresh bread could be supper in itself, nearly, with butter if available, jam if lucky, soup if sensible. Day-old bread then entered its second life: toast, stuffing, bread pudding, breadcrumbs, croutons, thickener, filler, foundation. Few foods moved through as many useful forms. Modern sliced sandwich bread made things easier in many ways, but it also thinned out a host of inherited habits around dough, crust, storage, slicing, and saving. There was wisdom in temperature and timing beyond the oven, too. A cook knew when to bring ingredients to room temperature, even if she did not use that phrase. She knew that some leftovers should cool before being tucked away, but not languish too long. She knew where to set butter for softening and where not to set it if the sun came hard through the window. She knew the afterheat of a stove and how to use it. A covered dish placed on the back of a warm range could be kept hot. A pan could finish gently off the strongest flame. A pudding might set in residual warmth. Fuel economy and culinary judgment often walked hand in hand. And there was the stove itself, which after the 1940s became easier, cleaner, and more standardized in many homes. Gas and electric ranges spread more widely, replacing older wood or coal stoves in many places, though unevenly and over time. Modern burners promised control. Thermostats promised consistency. Ovens became less mysterious. This was a blessing, and many women welcomed it gladly. No one should imagine that all old domestic hardships were cherished, but where machines simplify, they also conceal. Once you no longer tend fire or gauge heat by embodied familiarity, some old kitchen senses no longer need to remain so sharp. The same is true of ready-made cleaners, disposable products, and mechanized household labor after the war. Dishwashers, though not immediate in every home, gradually changed dish routines. Washing machines had already transformed laundry where available and affordable. Vacuum cleaners had changed floor care. Refrigerators, electric mixers, pressure cookers, and freezer compartments all altered the work map of the house. A woman no longer needed to know exactly the same things. She still needed judgment, but the location of judgment shifted. Instead of understanding how long yeast dough could be trusted in a warm kitchen before overproofing, perhaps she now needed to compare recipes from a magazine using cake mix and canned pineapple. History does not merely erase knowledge, it rearranges it. Still, many particular kinds of old kitchen wisdom slipped away because their daily necessity ended. Children born after the war, especially in suburban settings shaped by newer consumer culture, were less likely to absorb them as ordinary background. The post-war ideal kitchen was promoted as bright, efficient, modern, cheerful, and conveniently equipped. Advertisements celebrated labor-saving devices, frozen foods, instant puddings, packaged breads, electric gadgets, and standardized meals. There was excitement in this. There was relief in this. A woman who had spent years hauling, scrubbing, preserving, and improvising might very reasonably look at a shiny new refrigerator or a box cake mix and feel not loss, but gratitude. That is worth remembering. Nostalgia must be honest to remain gentle. The old wisdom was real, and much of it was skillful and admirable. But many women embraced post-war convenience because they knew exactly what it was saving them from. To romanticize every scrub board and sweating kettle would be unfair. The deeper truth is more human than that. They were capable in the old way, and many were delighted by the new way. Yet as the new conveniences spread, they often reduced the need to pass on the old methods in such complete form. A daughter might know how her mother cooked, but not why she tapped the melon that way, saved that string, dried that orange peel, or trusted her ear when jam reached a certain stage. One vanished wisdom was ingredient economy at the smallest scale. Older cooks saved things modern kitchens often discard without a thought. Not every scrap, certainly, and not foolishly. But orange peels might be candied or dried. Celery leaves flavored soups. Chicken fat could be rendered and used. Bread crusts became crumbs. Bones meant broth. Stale cookies could become part of a pudding or icebox dessert. Dripping from a roast had destiny. Even the water from boiling certain vegetables might be used in soups or gravies if suitable. This close-use kitchen economy reflected both necessity and habit. It made a woman alert to possibility. Another fading art was the silent management of guests and family appetites. The cook or housewife often knew who liked crust, who would eat turnips without complaint, who needed the tenderest piece because of weak teeth, who came home famished from work, and which child mysteriously recovered an appetite if jam tart appeared. She portioned with social intelligence. She stretched and disguised. She reserved. She coaxed. She held back enough pie for tomorrow while giving everyone the impression of abundance tonight. This too was domestic strategy. It did not appear on recipe cards, but homes ran on it. The family table in those years carried habits that also shifted after the 1940s. Meals were often more fixed in time because work, school, and cooking itself required it. The woman of the house could not always produce separate hot meals at scattered hours without reorganizing the entire day. The food was there when it was there. Children learned to come to table. Men washed up and sat down. The table might be formal or plain, but it had structure. Grace might be said. Napkins might be used daily, or only for certain meals. Chairs had usual occupants. Certain bowls always held certain things. The meal was not only food, it was a small daily ceremony of household order. In many homes, kitchen tables did double and triple duty. They were workbenches, homework desks, mending stations, coffee corners, and places for neighborhood talk. Dough was rolled there. Beans were snapped there. Bills were sorted there. Babies were fed there. A child recovering from illness might be settled there, with toast and weak tea or broth. A woman with tired feet leaned there before beginning supper. The modern kitchen island, much admired, is perhaps the sleek granddaughter of that old table, though with fewer stories stuck in its grain. You can wander now to the windowsill. Maybe there is a potted geranium, maybe a dish of apples, maybe a cooling pie, where a cat has been told very firmly not to look interested. Light changes in kitchens more beautifully than in almost any room. Morning makes enamel gleam. Afternoon lies warm on the floor. Evening turns glass dark and throws the room inward around its lamp and stove. Women knew these changes intimately because they worked through all of them. The kitchen was not a room glimpsed. It was inhabited in long stretches. One quiet wisdom almost gone now is the management of household smell. Not perfume, but the natural scent balance of a home. Cooking odours had to be aired. Cloths had to be rinsed before they soured. Bread boxes had to be kept from becoming stale little caves. Ice boxes had to be cleaned. Onions, cabbage, fish, mop water, and old grease each had their own warnings. Fresh air was a cleaning tool. Open the window a little. Prop the screen door. Set the dishcloth in the sun. Boil coffee if a smell lingered. Some might say, though methods varied and not every old trick deserves scientific endorsement. Still, the instinct was clear. A good house smelled lived in, not neglected. What about coffee itself? Few kitchen companions were more constant. Whether brewed strong, percolated on the stove, reheated a bit too long, or served fresh to a visitor, coffee had social and practical importance. The coffee pot stood for pause, hospitality, endurance, and routine. To put on coffee was to make room for conversation, though sometimes the conversation was simply with oneself in a brief quiet minute. The pot had to be cleaned, grounds had to be managed, strength had to be judged. This too was wisdom, and everyone had opinions. Few domestic subjects have produced more serene confidence with less universal agreement. The same can be said of pie pastry, biscuits, and how long to boil an egg. Kitchens generated schools of thought as naturally as churches generated committees. One woman swore by lard, another by butter, another by a mixture. One kneaded bread briskly, another said gentleness mattered more. One cooled cookies on brown paper, another on tins. One cut corn from the cob in a basin, another took it straight to the pan. Wisdom was not always singular. It was local, familial, practical, and often defended with a kindness that still left no doubt. Printed cookbooks from the era reveal this layered world very well. Some are systematic and scientific, especially those connected to home economics teaching. Others are community compilations full of church recipes, club recipes, and local favorites, where practical experience peeks through every line. Bake in a quick oven, add enough flour, season to taste, use leftover meat. These little phrases assume a cook already standing in a network of familiarity. Handwritten notes in margins often complete the record. More sugar, good, needs longer. Mummers. There is history in those penciled corrections. They show that kitchen wisdom was never passive inheritance. It was tested, altered, and made personal. And then there are the things that women knew about children and food. How to cool oatmeal quickly for a small, impatient mouth. How to hide grated vegetables in stews or meatloaves. How to make milk more welcome. How to keep a child occupied with dough scraps. How to judge if someone was truly ill or simply suddenly improved at the mention of school. How to produce a little treat from almost nothing on a birthday or after disappointment. The kitchen was often where emotional weather was managed as much as physical hunger. A scraped knee might lead to a chair at the table with a biscuit. A child anxious over a lesson might be set to shelling peas. A husband coming home tired might be greeted by the smell of supper before any grand explanation of the day. A neighbour in trouble could be steadied with a plate carried over. Food did not solve every sorrow, but kitchens supplied forms of care that were concrete, immediate, and widely understood. This remains true now, of course, though perhaps in different containers. By the late 1940s, a shift in domestic culture quickened. Wartime habits met peacetime consumer abundance. Manufacturers pushed labour-saving products more aggressively. New suburban homes were built around updated kitchens with fitted cabinets, improved refrigeration, electric ranges, breakfast nooks, and brighter surfaces. Home economics remained influential, but now convenience itself became an ideal. Canned soups turned into casserole bases. Gelatin salads multiplied with a kind of confidence only the mid-century could sustain. Freezer trays hinted at a future of planned ease. Mixes reduced the need to know the old ratios by heart. Advertising gently suggested that a good homemaker embraced the new. And she often did. Why should she not? If instant pudding allowed her 10 extra minutes with a child, or simply 10 extra minutes off her feet, that was no small gift. If a refrigerator reduced spoilage and daily marketing, that mattered. If waxed paper, cellophane, and packaged bread simplified wrapping and storage, that changed the rhythm of the day. But every simplification also made some older forms of watchfulness less central. A daughter helping her mother in 1955 might learn a different kitchen than the one her grandmother had run in 1935. Not worse in every way, just differently skilled. One can even see the change in language. Older generations spoke more readily of housewifery, housekeeping, putting up food, freshening, scolding, trying out fat, beating by hand, airing bedclothes, blacking stoves, boiling dish towels, setting sponge, and saving drippings. Later decades brought new vocabularies of convenience, gadgets, calorie counts, convenience dinners, frozen entrees, and eventually microwaves. When language changes, worlds shift with it. A whole cluster of practical verbs can vanish in a generation or two. Yet if you linger in this 1938 to 1945 kitchen long enough, what comes forward most strongly is not hardship and not quaintness, but fluency. The woman here is fluent in her environment. She knows how to move through the room efficiently, even when it is crowded. She knows the shelf heights, the pan weights, the quirks of the latch, the tendency of one burner to run hot, the way winter light reaches the work table by mid-morning. She can tell from the sound of a boiling pot whether it needs attention. She can carry on a conversation while her hands continue almost independently with peeling, stirring, wiping, and reaching. That fluency is easy to miss because it was ordinary, but it was real. And because it was ordinary, it often carried a quiet dignity all its own. No brass band announced it. No certificate hung over the stove to say that this woman could feed 6 people on very little, keep milk sweet in July, remove berry stains from a child's dress, pack a lunch pail, mend a sleeve, set bread to rise, and still put coffee before a caller with the appearance of ease. Yet all of that required mind, memory, stamina, and judgment. The old kitchen trained a kind of intelligence that was practical, adaptive, and rarely praised in formal ways. If you knew women like this, perhaps your mother, grandmother, aunt, neighbor, or the friend next door who could make supper out of what looked like one onion and determination, then you may feel their presence now, not as saints, not as symbols, just as capable women in house dresses and aprons, doing what needed doing, often with a little style and a little humour, perhaps with lipstick on, perhaps not, perhaps tired, perhaps cheerful, usually both at different hours of the same day. There were, too, tiny bits of kitchen theatre, the reveal of a cake, the first cut into a roast, the pride of opening pantry shelves for company, the good dishes for Sunday, the way a woman might smooth her hair before bringing a platter to the table, having spent all afternoon in practical battle with flour and steam. Homes have always had these quiet performances of care. They say, in effect, I thought of this. I prepared this. I am glad you are here to receive it. It is lovely to remember that older kitchens were often places where beauty was made from modest means. A plain table could be brightened with a cloth. A jar could hold flowers from the yard. Leftover fabric became curtains. A pie with a crimped edge looked festive without costing extra. A polished stove, a shining kettle, a row of blue jars, a neatly folded stack of towels, these were forms of domestic pleasure. They were not merely decorative. They announced that the home was being tended with attention. Sometimes wisdom also meant knowing when not to fuss. Soup did not need embellishment if it was good. Children did not need 7 side dishes if they would only eat mashed potatoes and peas tonight. A kitchen could become overcomplicated then as now. Experienced women often valued simplicity precisely because they had learned where effort mattered and where it did not. A plain supper served hot and on time had virtues all its own. In this, many of them were probably wiser than our era of recipes with 23 ingredients and a shopping list that reads like a treaty negotiation. If you are drifting now, let the old table hold the story for you. The clock ticks. The kettle breathes. The dish towel hangs by the sink. Nothing more is required of you. By the time the 1950s arrived in full colour, many of the old kitchen abilities still survived, especially in rural areas, among older women, in immigrant communities, and in families where thrift remained necessary or tradition remained strong. But the direction of change was clear. Fewer people canned because they had to. Fewer made bread because bakery bread was cheap and available. Fewer saved drippings because refrigeration, health advice, and changing taste shifted fat use. Fewer read weather through dough because air-conditioned modernity and standardized products softened those variables. Fewer knew the old cleaning methods because chemical cleaners and disposable paper changed household habits. Even so, traces lingered. The grandmother who could still tell doneness by smell, the aunt who never measured pie crust, the mother who washed and saved every bit of foil because it is still good, the neighbour who kept a jar of bacon grease by the stove long after magazines began to frown at it, the woman who folded grocery bags neatly because waste offended her nerves. Post-war modernity did not erase the old wisdom overnight. It sat beside it for a while. It borrowed from it. It often depended on it, especially in homes where money remained tight. And if we widen the view, we can say something more. The kitchen wisdom that seemed to vanish after the 1940s did not disappear simply because people grew careless or modern life became shallow. It faded because the conditions that made it necessary changed. Technologies reduced some risks and burdens. Markets offered more choice. Packaged goods replaced certain skills. Women's lives themselves changed profoundly, with more paid work, different expectations, new time pressures, and shifting ideals. When life changes, knowledge changes shape. Yet the old forms deserve remembrance because they tell us how much intelligence once lived in daily acts we are tempted to call simple. Perhaps one of the most touching lost abilities is patience with process. Dough rises when it rises. Broth takes time. Jelly reaches its point in its own moment. The floor is not truly dry because one wishes it so. In older kitchens, many outcomes could not be rushed. There were no shortcuts that actually worked beyond a certain point. Women learned to pace the day around these realities. Start this first, save that for later. Do the mending while the cake bakes. Shell peas while the stock simmers, sweep before supper. So much of household order rested on sequencing. Modern tools gave us speed, but not always rhythm. And rhythm may be what listeners recognize most tonight. Not every method, not every ingredient, not every utensil, but the rhythm of a home where one thing followed another with practiced care. Breakfast dishes, beds aired, marketing, soup started, laundry checked, child called in, table set, tea poured, floor swept one more time. In that rhythm there was weariness, certainly, but also steadiness. The kitchen sat at the heart of it like a warm engine. Many old kitchen tools seem humble until you imagine living without them. The hand egg beater clattering cheerfully in a bowl. The flour sifter making a soft white drift onto the counter. The potato masher, the rolling pin, the biscuit cutter, the paring knife sharpened enough to trust. The enamel canister set, the meat grinder clamped to the table in some homes, the pressure cooker hissing with a sort of authority no one ignored, the glass measuring cup if one had one, a little marvel of modern precision. Each object had to be cleaned, stored, used properly, and often repaired rather than discarded. Things stayed longer then. People knew them better. Utensils also carried memory by touch. A wooden spoon darkened by years of stirring, a mixing bowl with a chip on the rim, a canister lid that only one person could open properly because she knew the trick. Domestic history lives in these tiny, familiar stubbornnesses. New kitchens often sparkle, but old kitchens knew their people by hand. This is why the vanished wisdom of the 1940s kitchen is not only about foodways or housework, it is about relationship. Relationship between person and object, season and pantry, smell and judgment, leftovers and tomorrow, labor and care. In a world before convenience reached into every corner, the home asked more of the woman running it. In response, she developed a richer conversation with materials. She knew what cloth would shrink, what spoon would scorch, what pie plate baked best, what shelf kept the cake safe from children and cats, and what could be trusted to do by morning. A great many women also knew medicinal and comforting kitchen remedies in a loose domestic sense, though always within the limitations of the time. Warm broth for illness, tea and toast for unsettled stomachs, lemon and honey when available, soft eggs, milk toast, rice, applesauce, custard for someone recovering, ice chips if possible. The kitchen served as first responder to many ordinary discomforts simply because it held warmth, nourishment, and the means to make things gentle. Again, one must not overstate or romanticize, but it was common for care to begin at the stove. There were rituals around special days too, holiday baking, preserving for fairs, picnics, church suppers, birthdays, new babies, funerals, harvest meals. These occasions drew extra layers of kitchen knowledge from women. You had to know how to cook for quantity, transport food, keep things cool, decorate modestly, and cooperate with other women whose measuring habits might differ wildly, but whose authority in their own kitchens was beyond question. Anyone who has ever watched church basement cooking understands that diplomacy and potato salad have long shared the same table. As the evening deepens in this old house, the kitchen begins to quiet. Supper is over, dishes are done, or nearly done, chairs are pushed in, a leftover slice of pie is covered for tomorrow. The sink smells faintly of soap. A cloth is draped to dry. Perhaps tomorrow's beans are soaking. Perhaps bread dough is set. Perhaps the ration book is put back in its drawer. There is a final look around the room before the light is switched off or the lamp turned down. This glance is its own kind of wisdom. What needs doing first in the morning? What can be left? Is the milk put away? Is the stove safe? Is the cat where it should not be? A whole household rests easier because someone knew to ask these things. When historians study domestic life, they often must assemble it from fragments, advertisements, recipe books, oral histories, letters, home economics manuals, photographs, household accounts, and remembered habits. The women themselves frequently left fewer formal records than public men did, especially if they were not writers or professionals in the paid sense. Yet the evidence that remains is rich enough to show us a tremendous field of daily expertise. The kitchen, after all, was not merely backdrop. It was workplace, classroom, command center, and social room. To understand it is to understand much of ordinary family life in the first half of the 20th century. And perhaps that is why this topic feels so tender. So much of what mattered most in those homes was repeated, useful, and unglamorous, because it was ordinary. It was rarely celebrated in its own time. Yet that is precisely the kind of history that lingers warmly. Not grand events alone, but somebody knowing by sound that the percolator had gone long enough. Somebody turning stale bread into tomorrow's pudding. Somebody putting a kettle on before the visitor had fully sat down. Somebody wiping the table with a practiced hand and beginning again. In our own time, some of these old skills return as hobbies, artisan interests, slow living practices, or family nostalgia. People learn sourdough and canning, collect cast iron, save bacon grease with a wink, or seek recipes written in grandparents' cursive. There is pleasure in this, and also a kind of reaching back. Yet for the women of the 1930s and 1940s, such things were rarely hobbies first. They were life first. To remember that gives the story its proper proportion. And still, with all that has changed, you can see the line that connects then to now. A modern cook still stands at the counter and thinks, what can I make from what I have? Someone still saves soup for tomorrow. Someone still knows one burner runs hotter. Someone still keeps a favourite wooden spoon long after newer tools arrive. Someone still brings food to a neighbour, sets tea for a friend, or cuts fruit small for a child, because care is often most visible in tiny preparations. The forms change, the instinct remains. In many homes today, even where appliances hum softly and grocery stores offer every season all at once, the old kitchen wisdom survives in fragments of behaviour. A woman lifts a lid and knows, without timer or recipe, that the rice is ready. A grandchild watches dough being rolled and learns by seeing, not by lecture. A container of leftovers is tucked away because someone was already thinking of lunch tomorrow. A cookie tin waits in the cupboard because guests may come. A kitchen towel is saved because it is still perfectly good. These are not museum pieces. They are little continuities of practical affection. And perhaps that is the warmest modern parallel of all. Then, as now, the kitchen is often where care becomes visible. not always in grand feasts, but in ordinary maintenance, the fruit bowl refilled, the soup reheated, the floor swept before bed, the sandwich wrapped just so, the tea made stronger, because that is how a certain person likes it. In a world that praises novelty, these repeated domestic gestures can seem small, but they are how homes still tell their people, quietly and day after day, you are expected, you are remembered, you are looked after. So, as this old house settles and the kettle at last grows quiet, thank you for wandering gently through its kitchen with me tonight. I hope it brought back a little recognition, whether from your own memory or from the kind of home you can almost see in the lamplight, with the table wiped clean and tomorrow already waiting in the pantry. Good night, sleep well, and let the soft tick of the clock keep the story for you.